It has now been exactly 30 years since Edward Wolff disproved the core idea of trickle-down economics, this idea that wealth created at the top trickles down to everyone in society. But you still get people, intelligent people, well-intentioned people, saying things like this.
I think that the way you see the world as a trader is that the world is a zero-sum game, and that there's basically the pie is a fixed pie and it gets sliced up.
Okay, so who is Edward Wolff? He is an economist who wrote a book on wealth inequality and went on TV to talk about it. And it turns out that he has been calling for a wealth tax on YouTube as early as 2007. He is basically 2 decades early and one hoodie short of being Gary Stevenson. The biggest difference is that Rory Stewart might take him seriously because he has his PhD in economics from Yale and has literally spent a lifetime in academia working on the issue of inequality. If you watched this video that aired back in the year 2000 and just assumed that he was now living it up in retirement in Florida, you would be wrong. As far as I can tell, he is still lecturing at New York University and researching the economics of inequality to this day, thoroughly earning himself the number 7 position on my illustrious list of Nobel laureates and other leading economists backing a wealth tax. Why I said that he disproved trickle-down economics 30 years ago goes back to this article published on the 1st of February 1996, the day after his book Top Heavy, Increasing Inequality of Wealth in America and What Can Be Done About It, came out. In truth, he had of course been working on the issue of inequality for many years before publishing his book. He didn't just wake up one morning and decide to publish a book. And so he had been publishing academically for many years, but it was in February 1996 where he took these views mainstream, or at least he tried to do so. So let's have a look at this article published on the 1st of February 1996 and see what his views were back then and think about whether or not those are still valid issues to this day. And it starts off with the question, time for a wealth tax. Well, I mean, we're still asking that question, right? That's still a very valid question to be asking. And his tagline below it is that the current tax system in the United States leaves vast differences in wealth and power largely untouched. And I think further work by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, have established that the current tax system doesn't address the issue of wealth inequality sufficiently. So I think that's, perfectly valid to this day. You could have an article worded identically and being equally relevant today as it was back in 1996. Okay, so let's start off with some shock and awe. There were a record 129 American billionaires in 1995. Well, there's more than 800 now, so that's not such a shocking statistic anymore. And, shock and awe here, Bill Gates is more than 10 billion pounds, 12.9 billion pounds, and Warren Buffett 10.7, and the DuPont family 10 billion, and the Rockefellers 6 billion. And so these are shock and awe. He's opening up with trying to establish credibility that there is a massive concentration of wealth building up at the top of the pyramid. I mean, the idea is still valid. The numbers are not, right? Like right now in the United States, or in the world, right, we're rapidly approaching on having our first trillionaire. Elon Musk is worth $750 billion as of today. And you can see how that's grown over time. All these pop-up adverts. It was 20 billion, for many years. And from the 5 years from 2020, it just massively increased to 342 billion by 2025. And somehow between that and February 2026, it's more than doubled again to whatever it was, 774 billion, right? $750 billion, right? It's no longer worth talking in billions because it takes too long. Just say, oh, he's $750 billion. Let's just round down those 24 billion pounds to 750 billion and call him a $750 trillionaire. So yeah, we were rounding down by 24 billion pounds, which was the total wealth of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, back in 1996. Obviously not in real terms, this is in nominal terms, but anyway, it's now we round down by tens of billions, right? And look how many 100 billionaires, look at all these centibillionaires that there are in America now, all the way down to, I think Bill Gates is the poorest centibillionaire in America at the moment. But I mean, you just have to keep on scrolling and scrolling and scrolling to get down to somebody who's poorer than 10 billion pounds, right? Like, look at all of these decabillionaires that there are in America. I'm not going to waste my time scrolling that far. There's lots of them, right? There's lots of we're almost there. I might as well get to the poorest one. I thought I was. Oh, come on. There we go. Who's the poorest decabillionaire? Robert Duggan. I don't even know. Like, some of these people, they're worth £10 billion and you don't even know who they are, right? There's so many of them now. Anyway, so absolutely valid point. Look at all the wealth accumulating by the richest individuals in society, but the numbers pale in comparison, right? The richest person is worth $750 billion now. I can't even get my head around it. My mouth won't say the words properly, which is 60 times the wealth in nominal terms of Bill Gates in 1996. So wealth has increased massively, 60 times, 50 times. Warren Buffett is 10 times richer than he was in 1996. No, more than 10 times, right? 15 times richer. Anyway, many multiples times richer than they were in 1996. And the question is, well, what's happening to an ordinary family? They were worth just over $50,000 at the median at the same time. What's happened to their wealth? Are they also 60 times richer than they were? Are they also 50 or 20 or 15 times richer than they were in 1996? Well, we can have a look at the data on that and we can see, well, what is the wealth? So this is in 2022 dollars. So in 1995, you can see that's $111,000 was the median wealth in the United States, which is different to this number here, reported as 1995 median wealth, because this is in 1995 or 1996 dollars, right? Not 2022 dollars. So if you account for all of the inflation between 1995 and 2022, that's the same number, right? There's been like about a doubling of the value from 50-something thousand to 111,000. And you can see the wealth, continuing up to 192,000. But this data from the Fed only is up till 2022, so we have to use estimates or approximations to get to what it is today. The reality is that something happened after 2022. I don't know that I need to go into the detail of how COVID messed up the economy, but it wasn't dissimilar to what happened in 2007, I guess. And you can see this falling off of a cliff of median wealth between 2007 and 2010. So we should expect something similar here, right? So if it was worth, median household wealth was $192,000 in 2022, we should expect some sort of a falling off of a cliff. And so when we look at estimates out there, this is the UBS estimate, but you can use others. They estimate in 2025 that median wealth in the United States was this number here, $124,041, which is obviously much less than the 192,000 that was estimated back in 2022 by the Fed. Well, actually, that was not estimated as much as it was measured by the Fed back in 2022. So we know this was accurate, but we do think that it's fallen off since then, and this UBS estimate is down to 124,000. So if it's gone from 52,000, so the nominal increase, treating it on a like-for-like basis with, Bill Gates's, the wealthiest person's increase in wealth from 12.9 billion to $750 billion for Elon Musk. I'm not going to scroll all the way back up, it'll take forever. But we know that that's a 60 times increase in the wealth of the wealthiest person in America. Is this a 60 times increase in wealth for the median wealth holder? Well, 60 times 52,000 is 3,120,000, right? And this is not 3,120,000, right? It's just the 120,000 here, well, 124,000, right? It's just missing the 3 million. So no, the wealth of the median person in society hasn't increased by 60 times. It's increased from 52,000 to 124,000, which is not even 2.5 times, right? So in nominal terms, not in real terms, in nominal terms, the wealth of the median person has increased 2.5 times in America. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, I guess it depends on what inflation was over that period. Is there even a real increase in wealth? That's a good question, but one for in a little bit. So what's happening here? Well, this is perhaps, I think, the most important stat in the whole paper, which is that of the growth in wealth, so the wealth has increased between 1983 and 1989. So it's a very short period to analyze this. But the top 20% wealth holders acquired almost all of that growth in wealth. So at a national level, the pie got bigger. Yes, the pie did get bigger. I hate talking about pies when it's about it. Economic reality. But anyway, the pie got bigger between 1983 and 1989. And of that growth in the pie, 99% of the extra pie went to the top 20% of wealth holders, right? So the pie getting bigger had no added value to anyone below that level. So I think that's a really important stat, and he has a table on it shortly, which we'll get to it. I think there's also an interesting point here. Just trying to see where it is, trying to read and talk at the same time, about political power. Wealth inequality is tied to unequal political power. And I think the insights that he sort of highlights here in the intro, but also later on, about how growing wealth inequality undermines democracy is as relevant today as it was when he wrote this. What is wealth? I mean, I'm pretty sure this is just one of Gary Stevenson's YouTube videos, right? So I'm sure he has a What is Wealth YouTube video. Anyway, you can read that. It's interesting. If you're watching this video, I assume you know what wealth is. And the composition of household wealth. So how do ordinary people hold their wealth? Like, what is it in? Is it in money? Is it in S&P 500 index funds? No, 2/3 of it is just in the house that they living in, right? Owner-occupied housing. And then they've got some in liquid assets, cash. I don't know why a pension plan is a liquid asset. Some might argue it's not liquid. But anyway, investment in other real estate and unincorporated business for median income families. What that is sort of like a small business. Maybe a sole proprietorship or some small business. Obviously for the super rich, unincorporated businesses are businesses that they haven't yet taken public, right? So there's a very big difference in what that means. And corporate stock, 7% wealth in corporate stock. I want to focus on household assets, right? The owner-occupied housing. Most of their wealth is in their house. And so if their wealth has increased by 2.5 times in nominal terms over this period, since 1995 till 2025, what's important is whether or not that's still the case. Do they still own 2/3 of their house? And I've got this data here also. It's produced from the Fed data. It doesn't have the median exactly, but it's got how much of people's wealth is in real estate, which will just be their own house if you're not super wealthy, by quartiles. So the 25th to the 50th quartile will be the quartile immediately below the median, and the 50th to the 75th centiles will be the quartile immediately above the median. And so sort of the average of those two, I guess, won't be far off from the median. So how much of people's wealth is in their own home is somewhere between those two. And the 25th to the 50th quartile is 152% of their wealth is in their own house, but that's not their net wealth. You've got to subtract their mortgage. So they also own 93% of their net wealth on their mortgage. So if you subtract that, then you get to 59%, right? So 59% of their wealth is in their own home. And for the next quartile, it's 103% minus 36%. So that's 67%. So somewhere between 59 and 67% of their net wealth is in their owner-occupied home, which isn't, massively off of what it was back in 1989. So not much has changed. Maybe it's slightly less, but it's not hugely different. And the key thing there is that home has increased in value. So from 1995, in nominal terms, it's increased from 183 to 700, right? So what's that? 183 times 4? Just under 4, right? 4 times 180 is 720. So we're just under 4. I mean, not enough to round down to 3.5. It's like marginally under 4. Maybe it's 3.8 or 3.9 times the value. So house prices have increased by almost 4 times since 1995, but average wealth has only increased 2.5 times, and this is for people for whom 2/3 of their wealth is in their house. And so that says something's going wrong, right? If they had just sat on the same house, that part of their wealth should have increased 4 times. But in aggregate, their wealth is only increasing 2.5 times. So they're either losing some of the value from their house, having to remortgage a bit. Maybe they're having to sell other assets to fund lifestyle. But essentially, if your main asset is increasing 4 times, but your overall wealth is increasing 2.5 times, that's a bad indicator, right? Something's gone wrong with your portfolio somewhere. And probably it means that they have to consume some of their assets to survive. And that's why their wealth has increased slower than the rate of increase in their main asset. Okay, so I think there's an important insight into that. And it's also really important insight just at a headline level, why we talk about the housing market and house prices so much when we talk about wealth inequality and what median wealth holders do with their money, because so much of it is about just being able to afford their own home. The next really important insight, okay, this here is quite interesting. There's an insight here about how, of the different asset classes, who owns most of them. Principal residence is still owned by ordinary people, mostly. Was. And at for other asset classes like stocks, bonds, trusts, business equity, most of that wealth is held by the wealthy. I think that's probably still true. I don't think that's the most important thing. There was a different cut of this here. Is this it? Yes. So this is about how quickly that wealth has increased over time, and how it's then been allocated by different groups by wealth, right? So if this is the pie getting bigger, right? Like this is the main point that I was talking about earlier. Here's the 98.8% key takeover. Like if the pie is getting bigger, who's getting the extra pie? And in this case, it's 98% is going to the top 20% by wealth, and this is for the period from 1983 to 1989. And actually, it's more focused than that. 2/3 of, 3/5 of it is going to the top 1%, right? So the other 37% is going to the second centile to the 20th centile, right? And 61.6% of it is just going to the top centile. So it gets massively, massively more concentrated as you go up the distribution towards that top 1%, right? Yes, top 20% is consuming or is getting allocated all of that growth in wealth pretty much. But the top 1% is getting a massively asymmetric proportion of it. And this is hugely telling, but it is also problematic that this is only 6 years worth of data, right? We're looking from 1983 to 1989. It's not a particularly long period to be looking at when you're thinking about the distribution of wealth over the long run. And so Edward Wolff updated the same analysis much later on. This is a publication in 2017 by him. And you can see exactly the same analysis. Okay, it's just broken down into more categories. So we're not just looking at the top 1% or the top 20% or the bottom 80%, right? He's broken them down into bigger disaggregations. He still starts at 1983. So the starting point is the same here, right? 1983, but instead of taking it to 1989, he takes it to 2016. So this is a massive, massive increase in the period over which this analysis is being done, right? It's more than 30 years now. What's that, 33 years or so? Yeah, something like that. And what's happened? Has wealth increased? Yes, wealth has increased in real terms, right? This isn't nominal. This is in 2016 dollars. So the total wealth, the total pie, this old column on the far right hand side here saying the pie was 313. The pie is now 668 if you round up. Right, so the pie has gotten bigger. It's more than doubled. It's increased by more than 100%. So the pie has gotten bigger. Yes, the pie has gotten bigger. Yay. Now, is everyone getting a bigger slice? Maybe some people getting a much bigger slice and some people getting slightly bigger slice. Well, that's the question. And that's why you break it down into all of these categories by wealth. The top 0.1%, their average wealth in 2016 dollars back in 1983 was $43 million. And by 2016, the average wealth of the top 0.1% was $100 million, $101 million. Forgive me if I don't round off correctly. reading and talking all at the same time. Anyway, likewise, so that's increased by more than 100%, and likewise for the top 0.5%, and if you extend it to the top 1%, it's increased by 150% also. And if we look at the second to the 5th centile, right, the next 4% from the top 1%, it's actually largely a similar story, increasing by 150%. All of these categories increased by more than the average increase in the pie, right? The average increase was 113%, and all of these categories had their wealth increasing by more than 113%. And then we look at the next 5%, right? So from the 6th centile to the 10th centile, and their wealth has increased by, basically exactly the same as the average, right? So you only did better than average if you were in the top 5% of wealth holders in America. You did exactly average, almost exactly average, if you were in the 6th to the 10th centile of wealth holders. And you did below average if you were in the 11th to the 20th centile, right? The next 10% from the top 10%. So the 11th to the 20th centile, your wealth increased by only 80.5%, right? So you did worse than average. Which is saying something, right? The top 5% do above average, the next 5% do averagely, and everybody else does less than average. So only 5% of people are doing above average, which, is a massive skew. Anyway, so the top 20%, this is just the average for the top 20%, but the only reason it does above average is because it's pulled up by the top 5%, right? So it's not saying that the top 20% do better than average. They do on aggregate, but it's only the top 5% that do better, and the other 15% in the top 20% do, equally well to average or worse. And so, yeah, I would ignore the top 20% column if you're sort of thinking about these things. The 4th quintile, right? So we talk about these things in quintiles, and then you go from the top 20% to the 4th, not the 2nd, right? Because it's 4th from bottom, right? You have top, and then you have 4th from bottom, 3rd from bottom, and then bottom 40th. So this 4th 20% means 4th from bottom 20th, or 2nd from top, right? So this is the 21st centile wealthiest to the 40th centile wealthiest. So the 2nd from top 20% wealthiest, or the 4th from bottom 20% wealthiest, or least wealthy. Anyway, they grew by 40%, which is much worse than average, and the middle 20%, right, the 3rd from bottom, which is also the 3rd from top when you're talking about quintiles, right, their wealth grew from $81,700 in real 2016 dollars to $81,700 in real 2016 dollars, right? So you don't need to be a mathematician to know that their wealth grew by 0.0%, which is not at all. And worse, the bottom 40% wealth had their change in wealth go from $6,900 to negative $8,900, right? So their wealth reduced at a level that you couldn't even calculate the percentage because it crossed zero, right? It went from being positive to zero. So on average, people had $6,900 of net wealth in 1983, even if they were in the bottom 40% of wealth holders, right? That's the average. Some of them might have had negative wealth already, right? Maybe the bottom 10%, bottom 20%. But that has changed over the 34 years between then and 2016, so that on average, people in the bottom 40% have negative net wealth. They might have equity in a home, right? They might be homeowners and have some equity in their home, $50,000 equity in their own home, but then they would also have maybe $58,900 in credit card debt or something like that there, so that their net is $8,900 indebted. So that's the story, and that's the distribution of how that how that increased pie has been distributed between different wealth groups in society, right? And so you can say, well, who got, what percentage of the growth in the pie, and that's what this column here, the percent of the gain is. So the top 0.1% got 16.3% of the growth, and the top 5% in total, you have to add these, sorry, got 76% if you add those two together. They got 70, so more than 3/4 of the growth of the pie went to the top 5%, the top 1% plus the top plus the next 4%. So they got 3/4 of the growth in the pie. The next 5% got 12% of the growth in the pie. The next 10% got 93% 9.3% of the growth in the pie. So that in total, all of these groups got together 97.4% of the growth in the pie. And then the second quintile of wealth got 4.3. So this is the fourth lowest or the second highest quintile of wealth. Got 4.3% of the growth in the pie. So they got something. That's not bad, not bad at all. Like 39.1% growth seems like a big number, right? This is over 34 years, right? So this is a minuscule, like at a compounding rate, we're talking about a very, very tiny percentage growth in wealth over this time period. They only got 4.3% of the growth of the pie. And the third quintile, the middle quintile, the median quintile, the average person in society, they're no better off. The median person, the ordinary person, the average person is exactly the same in wealth terms in 2016 as they were in 1983. And worse than that, if you're anywhere below the median, you're likely to be worse off than you were in 1983. Maybe even you've gone from having positive net wealth to having negative net wealth, right? So you've gotten a negative share of the growth of the pie, right? This is the whole point, right? Everyone goes, oh, the pie's getting bigger, the increased wealth at the top will trickle down to the bottom. Well, tell that to the people who have got a negative share of the growth in the pie. Tell that to the people whose wealth has gone from being positive to being negative, or just to the ordinary people who haven't had any share of that growth, right? The median person's wealth is exactly unchanged, despite the fact that you've got all of this wealth growth happening at the top. So yeah, I think this is the main take home. Like this is the main take home of the paper back in 1996 when it was published. And yes, you could have said, okay, well, how much weight can you really put in this? This is only data from 83 to 89. Like, you can have a bad decade, it's not even a decade, right? Well, yes, that was it then, but exactly the same thing. What was it then? It was 98.8% was going to the top 20%, and now it's where's top 20%? 97.4%. Okay, so maybe it's gotten a little less bad. It's dropped from 98.8% going to the top 20 to 97.4% being allocated to the top 20%. So I don't know, maybe you can say that's progress, but it just feels like it in reality, it's basically the same. So this result stands up, right? Like, one or 2 percentage points differences don't really move the needle on anything. So the conclusions that he reached back in 1995, even if it was on slightly thin data, are the correct conclusions because that fact has been borne out in the long term by this data here, all the way to 2016. And what were those conclusions? Well, the main conclusion is that we should have a wealth tax, right? There's a lot of conclusions that he has here, and I would recommend reading it. Not all of it, has stood the test of time in terms of what would be the best type of wealth tax. I think he has a more progressive wealth tax. Where is it? It's here somewhere. There we go. You can see sort of quite a progressive wealth tax that he would apply across different wealth classes, and maybe he still stands by that, in different tax rates that apply to different categories. A bit like income tax, right? You have different tax thresholds and different marginal rates of tax on income. Between those thresholds, here you have wealth thresholds and different marginal rates of tax on wealth between those different thresholds. And also he has some ideas on what should be excluded from wealth. And okay, if you own a car, that doesn't count as long as it's worth less than $10,000. And here we go, the automobile exemption. Like it seems a bit complicated to me. I don't think there's any way for it to not be complicated in reality. So that's not a real criticism. I think also some of the points that he makes about other wealth tax systems, he was quite optimistic about how they were doing back in the mid-90s. I think time has tested those systems and they haven't all stood up to the hype. But we can learn from that, right? We can absolutely learn from how all of these countries' wealth taxes might have been deficient in different ways, might have been eluded by the wealthy in different ways, and so it didn't have as much of an effect in the long run as the hope was. But anyway, the conclusion, like the headline conclusion is, well, then you can't tax income. If income isn't resulting in the redistribution that you would want it to, right? We have a progressive income tax system because it's meant to be redistributive. And if you're not achieving that through income tax, you sort of need to do it through a wealth tax. And then that's ultimately the headline conclusion. And he builds up that rationale for a wealth tax. I'm not sure, like he's quite optimistic that a wealth tax might incentivize the wealthy to invest in higher yielding investments. Yeah, possibly. I'm a bit skeptical about that, to be honest. But anyway, these are minor points, like minor points of differences between the lines, right? But the headline conclusion of why things like an estate tax are so porous, and the fact that we need a wealth tax, and how it might be implemented. Like these are really key insights that he had way back in the mid-90s, but the same problems and issues that Edward Wolff was talking about in the mid-90s are still the same things that we're grappling with in the mid-2020s, right? The issue of growing wealth inequality and the destabilizing effect that has on democracies, societies, and on the economy. We need to grapple with these issues, understand them, and solve them. And the solution hasn't actually changed that much, right? Yes, I know there's some changes around the margins of how you would actually construct a wealth tax, but the core idea that, well, we need to tax wealth directly. We can't trust a progressive income tax regime to deal with this problem of wealth inequality. And I mean, it may be a problem in itself, depending on your view on issues of equality, but it's definitely a problem for the effects it has on democracy, society, and the economy, right? And so we need to solve this problem, and the solution hasn't changed in 30 years, really. And it's really instructive and interesting to go back to what was being said in the mid-90s and draw those parallels to this very day, right? And say, okay, well, this is what has happened, this is what has changed, this is what we can learn over this period of time. Really, if we had solved it the way that the proposed solution was back in the mid-90s, how would the world be different now? And likewise, okay, I don't like scare tactics, but the message is, well, if we don't do this for another 30 years, why would we not expect things to continue going as they're going, right? Like the change between the mid-90s and the mid-2020s, why would we not just expect to extrapolate all the issues around undermining of democracy and the weakening of Western economies if we don't solve the issue that's causing them? We know what the problem is. We've known what the solution is for a long time. The only difference is that right now, there's a moment in political time that politicians are listening to the fact that growing wealth inequality is a problem and that the solution is a wealth tax. And so I think it's really important to grab this moment and to affect the change that needs to happen to change the course of history, right? Because we've had 30 years of not doing so, right? Since, it became obvious that it was necessary. And I just don't think many economies are going to manage another 30 years of the same. So it's important to grab this moment in time and take advantage of the fact that politicians are taking a wealth tax seriously. Some of them publicly, some of them privately, but it is starting to become a mainstream issue that is being accepted as, well, the solution could be a wealth tax, right? This is something that is a valid solution that we could put in our political manifesto at the next election, right? This is something that isn't a ridiculous idea for multiple parties in the UK and around the world. It is something that is a credible idea, and we need to make sure that there's the evidence and it's obvious that there's the political will, there's the grassroots societal movement behind that sort of a policy intervention, behind that being in a political party's mandate for an election, so that they do put it there and that they then also have to then follow through on it.